So to get started, I'm just going to ask a simple question, which is, how many hours did you work last week? The answer might be 40, the answer might be 60, the answer might be 80, or the answer might be none because you're looking for a job. But regardless of what that answer is, as we go through some of the presentation today, which will be about 20 minutes long, I want you to keep that number in the back of your head, because the number of hours we're working in a week directly impacts our ability to be a better citizen of Montana and the United States. Now, over the course of my organizing career, I've had a lot of people tell me, Bob, unions were great back when headlines like this were popping up all over the place. This is from the Granite Mountain Speculator Fire in Butte in 1917, and there were industrial accidents all over the country. Boston, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York, the Calumet, Michigan Italian Hall disaster, where women and children were massacred by the mine owners. And they tell me, Bob, back then, unions made a difference. Back then, there were no laws to protect working people, and so you had to have organized labor. And I say, organized labor back then was just as relevant as the First Amendment of the United States Constitution is today. And if you believe the right to assembly and the right to free speech still matter as I do, then you probably also believe in some of the words from the IBEW's founding document back in 1891. And first and foremost, our object then, as it is today, was to bring everybody that worked in our industry into our midst so that we could cultivate feelings of friendship amongst those who worked in our industry. So we could settle disputes between employers and employees by arbitration. I want you to remember this one because it's as relevant today as it was back in 1891, especially in terms of the PRO Act. We wanted to assist each other in sickness and distress, to seek a higher standard of living, to reduce the hours of daily labor, because we believe then and still believe today that when folks have a little bit of time when they're not at work, that they can, by legal and proper means, elevate their moral, intellectual, and social conditions, not only of themselves, but of their families and their children, not just for a better life for them, but in the interest of a higher standard of citizenship. And the IBEW wasn't alone. This is a picture from the Ladies Auxiliary of the International Mine, Mill, and Smelter Union in Butte, and their union and the Women's Protective Union in Butte that was chartered, I believe, in 1894. If you read the founding documents of that organization, they would read like headlines from today, where all the way back then in 1894 English, the women of Butte were advocating for things like they should be able to go to work without a male employer harassing them. They should be able to go to work and get equal pay as their male counterparts. And for 130 years, the Women's Protective Union of Butte advocated, and through their successors still advocates today, for things that the rest of the country is just seemingly now discovering when it comes to political will. And it all stemmed from this. The basic equation that organized labor believes in is that there's 24 hours in a day. In those 24 hours, if we give 8 hours of our time over to work, we should then have 8 hours to rest. And because of those 8 hours that we've given to work, we should have enough money in our pocket that for the other 8 hours, we should be able to do with our time what we will. That might mean taking our kids to a Little League game or attending a PTA meeting or whatever it is. But the basic equation is this. If you work, regardless of what you do for those 8 hours, that should be enough to at least provide the basics like food and shelter and healthcare, so that you have a little bit more time to not only invest in your families, but invest in your state and your country as well. Because when people who just work for a living have that time in those 8 hours, they don't just do things for themselves, they do things for society. So here's the kind of headlines organized laborers always like to see, that when we pass things like child labor laws, that means kids go to school instead of going to work in the mines or going to work at the textile looms. And what that ultimately equates to is a better society for all of us. Unfortunately, not everybody saw or still sees things that way. And this is a picture from Butte in 1914, when, with the backing of the governor, the Anaconda Copper Mining Corporation brought in the regular United States Army to protect the mines of Butte from unruly mobs. And you can see the unruly mob that showed up at the gates of this mine this particular day. It was a bunch of toddlers and young children coming to see the Browning submachine gun that would be leveled off at their working fathers when they went into the mine. And so that wasn't just in Butte, that was all over the country. These pictures are all from the year 1934. And in Butte, in San Francisco, in Chicago, in Minneapolis, in the heart of the Great Depression, when 1 in 3 American workers were out of work and couldn't find a job, people were going on strike in droves. And it sounds counterintuitive, but the reason they were going on strikes is just like today. Back then, there were some unscrupulous actors that decided to take advantage of a global pandemic. In this case, it was an economic pandemic. And just like today, where you have unscrupulous actors price gouging and artificially manipulating supply lines and things like that, you had the same thing going on when it came to labor. People taking advantage of working people that were desperate. The difference was back then, they didn't take it lying down. And so throughout 1934, there were strikes all over the country, from every little town to every big city and every industry you can imagine. And so in 1935, with bipartisan support, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Wagner Act, which today is the National Labor Relations Act. And you heard James make reference to the PRO Act being the first meaningful piece of labor legislation since the 30s. This was the old bill that he was talking about. And as a result of taking the organizing process from the streets and putting it into a federally sanctioned voting booth in a secret ballot election, you can see what happened. More and more people joined the ranks of organized labor in this country from the late 30s through the 40s. But then along the lines of about 1960, give or take, after the passage of some amendments to the National Labor Relations Act, as well as a big expansion in the American economy and changes in the way in which we went about working, union membership started to decline. The other component as to why union membership started to decline is because it became more and more difficult to organize under the old archaic law. Labor started to become more concerned about protecting what it already had than extending the benefits of organized labor to all working people. And so part of this, quite honestly, was self-inflicted. But the vast majority of the driving force over these intervening decades has been the problems with labor law. And what it boils down to is this: when more people are part of organized labor, good things happen not just for those members, they happen for the whole country. These are some of the things that organized labor helped pass. Child labor laws. In Montana, we passed the first Workmen's Compensation Act in the country, and organized labor was right there doing it. The 19th Amendment, which extended the right to vote to half Americans, the women that had never before had the right to vote, organized labor helped with that. The National Labor Relations Act, Social Security, Fair Labor Standards Act, which still sets minimum wage in the 40-hour work week. The pictures of A. Philip Randolph, who helped organize the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. A. Philip Randolph was a pioneering labor leader with the Brotherhood of Pullman Porters. And the March on Washington, if it's remembered for nothing else, it's remembered for Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech that will echo through the ages of American history. And those are the sorts of things, all these laws, the Montana Constitution in 1972, that whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, conservative or progressive, it doesn't matter. Everybody holds that document up as a shining example of what can happen when people come together, set aside their differences, and work for the common good. Labor was right there at the table when all that happened. And it happened because regular working people had 8 hours in a day to do things like be concerned about their fellow citizens and pass laws like these. It doesn't just stop with the laws that get passed or don't get passed when labor union membership declines. The share of wealth in the middle class declines as well. And there's not an economist alive, right, left, or center, that would say more money in the pockets of the middle class is a bad thing. And the reason for that is simple. So this is the difference between union membership and the share of income going to the top 10%. And you can see that basically as union membership goes down, more and more money goes to the top. And the reason that's a problem in terms of broad economy is because when a working person, an electrician or a waitress or a teacher has a few extra bucks in their pocket and a few more hours in a given day to do with that money what they will, they go out and they do things like shop for a car or remodel their bathroom or take their kids on a trip or go out to dinner. When the top 1% has a little bit of extra money in their pocket, they do things, as you're seeing now, left and right, like build spaceships so that they and their buddies can take a little cruise in the stratosphere. Now, that's great. They can do that all they want, but there's no comparison as to which of those two situations has the most impact on the average American worker and their role in the American economy. So the long and short of it is, when unions are stronger, the middle class is stronger. And when the middle class is stronger, the United States of America and Montana and the world at large is stronger as well. Now, the only time since 1935 the National Labor Relations Act has ever really been amended was in 1947 with something called the Taft-Hartley Act. And that was passed over the veto. They overrode the veto of President Truman to pass it. And that set up stuff like right-to-work laws. It took away some of the more effective tools that organized labor was using to organize during those years. And I bring that up because I want you to understand that since 1935, there's only been one meaningful modification to labor law in this country, and it was to take away rights from workers. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't still some things in the law that are valuable for a working person today, whether you're union or not. I want to go over some of the highlights, I guess, of the National Labor Relations Act and how they affect you. First and foremost, I want to emphasize the point that I made earlier, that unions are not a thing of the past. Just in my time working here in Montana, I've seen and met everything and everybody from women who are customer service representatives out in the eastern part of the state, whose employer installed phones and little flip down desks in the bathroom stalls so that if they were in there and the phone rang, they had a place that they could take the call. I've heard employers who are doing business with the state of Montana under state-let contracts tell their employees that if they don't like how things are, they have two choices. They can quit or they can kill themselves. I've talked with park workers from other countries who are working seasonally in the crown jewels of our two national parks who had their passports held under lock and key by their employers while they were here working. I've met individuals that through no fault of their own and through real disabilities were forced to deal with battles of incontinence at their workstations because their employer wouldn't let them get up to use the restroom. All that stuff has happened in the last 15 years here in the last best place. So don't tell me unions are a thing of the past and we no longer have a role. Another big point that I've often heard over my years of organizing is that somebody will be working in a job where they don't see their particular profession in the name of a union, like electrical workers or boiler makers or steel workers. But the way the labor law is set up is any union can represent anybody. So if you're out there and you're having issues in the workplace and you think you'd like to know a little bit more about organizing, there are a lot more options than the ones that employer laid out to those employees of quit or kill yourself. The third option is change things. And that's what the National Labor Relations Act and organizing is set up to do. So in Montana, the IBEW represents everybody from law enforcement officers to aircraft mechanics to obviously electrical workers. So just because you don't see your name in a union, don't be afraid to call somebody up. If nobody else will talk to you, I know the IBEW will. One of the big misconceptions in Montana and in many states is that employers are required to give paid breaks, paid vacations, or holidays. They are not. There are some administrative rules in the state that govern if they do those things, how they function. But the long and short of labor law here and other places is that employers can legally do a whole lot. And the reason the law is silent on so much of this stuff is the intent of the National Labor Relations Act back in 1935 was to promote collective bargaining. And so labor law elsewhere is silent on things that Congress assumed would get bargained over, like paid breaks, vacations, and holidays. So if you want those things, it's up to you to organize your workplace. This is one that's always been common, and my guess is as employers are out there competing for workers in a tight marketplace like today, it's probably more common. I don't think there's anybody that's ever taken a job where their employer has not told them, do not discuss what we're paying you with your coworkers. And the reason for that is simple, especially in today's market. That's because a lot of people are getting hired off the street for more money an hour than what somebody that's been there for 10 or 15 years is getting paid. And so the employer doesn't want that getting out, because when those conversations start happening, the next conversation that should happen is, what can we do about that? And that conversation falls under Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act, which establishes something called protected concerted activities. And so the takeaway is this. Today in the state of Montana or anywhere else in the United States of America, if you're a working person that's got an issue at work, whether it's a raise that never came or a confusing manner in which you're evaluated, some metrics equation that takes into account your productivity and X, Y, and Z that's never been fully explained, or you were told one thing and something else happened, or your healthcare got meddled with, or any of the million different things that I've seen over the years. If you run into those situations, don't take it up by yourself with your management. Get another coworker to go in that meeting with you, or go in and speak on behalf of your coworkers. And the reason for that is that by engaging in a group of two or more, or on behalf of a group of two or more, you're opening up a whole new level of protection for yourself and your coworkers under Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act. This isn't, unscrupulous. This isn't underhanded. This is the law, and it's there for a reason, because they understood back in the 1930s what we seem to forget too often today, and that's when regular working people have a little bit more in their pocket and a little bit more time to do with that money and that time what they will, we're a better country for it. Finally, even today under the old National Labor Relations Act that goes back to 1935, you cannot be legally fired for starting up a union, but I do want to emphasize the process is difficult. And the process is difficult, namely because the law that sets up the whole process of forming a union was established for the way workers worked back in 1935. The mines in Butte look different today than they did in 1935. The rest of the industries that were organizing that summer from San Francisco to St. Louis either are gone or look drastically different than they did back in 1935. And so the end result of all of this is, even today, that fundamental equation that we believe in organized labor of you don't have to have a college education in order to find your way into the middle class, or you shouldn't have to pay out your pocket for trade schools, or you shouldn't have to pay out your pocket for student loans just to even have a shot at the middle class. What we still believe in is what these two young ladies that are part of our apprenticeship program discovered, is that you can actually earn a really good middle class living right out the gate while you're learning on the job in an apprenticeship program and going to school on the side for 4 or 5 years, depending on the program that you're in. And so these young ladies here, when they started day one, instead of signing up for a student loan, they instead were getting paid 60 or 65% of the journeyman scale for an electrician in their area, which, depending on where they were in the state of Montana, that would have been well north of $20 an hour day one starting wage, with guaranteed family health care, guaranteed raises, and, oh, by the way, guaranteed training that's going to lead to a journeyman's ticket that can take you anywhere. So that's the root of why organized labor does what we do and where we came from, and why it's so important that we start to re-examine labor law in this country that hasn't been touched since the 1930s. It's for those two young ladies in that previous slide so that they have more access to things like our apprenticeship program, so that they have more access to things like a seat at the table and open communication with their employer. That's what it all boils down to. So just in conclusion here today, some basics on what the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, does. First and foremost, it updates 1935 labor law to account for the 21st century workforce. You know, as progressive as somebody like President Roosevelt was back in 1935, not even in his wildest imagination could he imagine Uber or Google or other gig economy situations that we're seeing today that are becoming the norm for how people go to work. And so the PRO Act updates the definitions of who is an employee, who's eligible to organize under federal law, and all that stuff, basically to reflect the changes that have occurred in how we go to work every day. Now, remember back, I said to remember settling first contracts through arbitration. The IBEW has been advocating for that since the 1890s. And it's because it's a system that works. It's a system that leads to better relationships between employers and employees. And it's a system that allows both sides to get beyond their disputes and move on to the real business, which is growing the employer and growing the country. So long story short, if Tom Brady, when he was a younger player, could have a contract dispute with the New England Patriots, and instead of him having to go on strike, they took that to a neutral third party, and the Patriots brought in their case, and Tom Brady brought in his case, and the arbitrator said this side or that side is more correct and made the award. If that system works for them, then that system works for everybody. And oh, by the way, it's the same system that right now in Montana we use to settle contracts for law enforcement and for firefighters in the state. And the PRO Act simply extends that to all working people that take the steps to organize. The PRO Act makes the organizing process less hostile. So that conversation I told you about where the employer told their employees they could quit or they could kill themselves happened during what is called a captive audience meeting in the course of an organizing campaign. So an employer on the clock forces their employees to basically come into anti-union indoctrination. The PRO Act takes those meetings and makes them so they're no longer mandatory for an employee. If they choose to attend on their own time after hours, no problem. It adds teeth to the unfair labor practices process enforcement. So right now, you know, under labor law, there's no punitive damage. There's no, and as a result of that, there's no reason in a lot of cases for an employer not to fire somebody, like they once did to a friend of mine that worked in Missoula at a call center facility down there years ago. And they looked at the situation, said, hey, we're not going to be out anything except what we owed him anyway, so let's fire him for organizing. The PRO Act adds teeth to the enforcement. And finally, the PRO Act reverses some of the most anti-worker Taft-Hartley provisions, some of those things that allowed unions to grow and as a result grow the middle class so rapidly from the 1930s to the 1950s. You heard James talk about repealing right to work or beating back right to work in Montana. The PRO Act repeals some of the more egregious provisions of the Taft-Hartley Act and right to work provisions. And most importantly, the reason we're having this call today is the PRO Act has a Senate hearing this Thursday. So this is a piece of legislation that's already passed the House, is now entering into the Senate, and it's closer than it's ever been since 1935. And it's going to take all working people, whether they're a member of organized labor or not, to get behind this if we want to see things like an 8-hour day equation. And this is a headline. I like the old newspaper headlines from the Union Metallic Cartridge Company. So these girls that they were talking about in the headline were making bullets, and they were probably making bullets, my guess, in 1917 for the American war effort in Europe. And they were fighting for an 8-hour day back then, just as organized labor still fights for an 8-hour day today, because we believe then and believe now that when working people have 1/3 of that equation, and the means, because they're working to do with it what they will, that benefits the whole country. And it really is that simple. Montana has a long, rich history of organized labor on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats alike. And we saw that this last legislative session with the right to work bill. So I say all this because I truly believe, from my time being an organizer in this great state, that there's work that needs to be done in terms of labor law reform. But I also believe that, even under the current law, the best thing a working person can do, like Dwight D. Eisenhower once said, was go join a union. And so with that, James, I'll go ahead and transition things back over to you. And if there were any questions or anything that came in, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But other than that, thanks everybody for your time, and work safe.